Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Quick program note. Tomorrow, is the day before early voting begins in the New York primaries. And so we'll have our John Campbell on to talk about some of the big races. We've been having some of these candidate forums on the show. We'll talk about those and start to take your phone calls about who you're deciding to vote for in some of these hotly contested races. We'll also talk about some of the other races that we haven't gotten to. Also tomorrow, we'll preview the outstanding Supreme Court cases that we're waiting on. Today was a Supreme Court decision day, but none of the biggies came down. Here, late June, it's the end of the term, and there are big decisions yet to come on birthright citizenship, TPS, temporary protected status, for many immigrants, transgender athletes, all of that and more on tomorrow's Brian Lehrer Show. Now, Ukraine has largely faded from American headlines, right? But the rest of the world is paying much closer attention than we are. As the Gulf states find themselves at war with Iran, they have turned to those with the most experience with drone warfare in particular, and those are the leaders of Ukraine. And defense tech giants like Palantir are making the same pilgrimage. Joining us to explain why is Francis Farrell, reporter at the Kyiv Independent. Francis joins us from Kyiv. Hello from New York, Francis. Welcome to WNYC.
Hi, Brian, from Kyiv. Good to be here.
And you write, just to dive right into the middle of this, that on top of its arsenal of ballistic missiles, Iran's weapon of choice is one that is all too familiar to Ukraine, the Shahed-type drone. What are you referring to there? Give people a one-on-one lesson on the Shahed-type drone.
So, sure, yeah. The Shahed drone was invented by Iran. It's a one-way, very cheap, very simple, you could say, loitering mission. It's a small, triangle-shaped suicide drone, which uses a basic petrol engine to fly for over hundreds of miles into a target. And there's a reason in Ukraine we often call them mopeds, because that's what they sound like when you hear them outside your window. And in 2022, Russia basically not only bought a lot of these Shahed drones from Iran, but also acquired the license for them and started producing them inside Russia. And what they did was they used them together with their ballistic and cruise missiles in these big mass attacks against Ukrainian cities, against Ukrainian infrastructure. And very quickly, Ukraine realized that if they use their very precious and very expensive anti-air missile systems against these Shahed drones, which only cost about $50,000 each, then very quickly they're going to run out, and there's going to be nothing to shoot down the drones, the missiles, and their cities will be left undefended. And that's why Ukraine set up a completely different system for handling them. They shoot them down with machine guns from pickup trucks, and now they've been shooting them down with interceptor drones of their own. In the meantime, Russia's been modifying these Shahed drones. They're now very different to the Iranian original. They have sometimes jet engines. They have mesh radio systems that speak to each other as they fly. A lot more stealth attributes and just better specs. But now when Iran has been using the original Shahed drone against countries all over the Gulf, it seems like the world, including the US, has not learned the same lesson that Ukraine learned way back almost 4 years ago.
In other words, when Trump and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth were boasting at the beginning of the war about destroying so much of Iran's military and so many of their missile sites and all of that, which may have been true, but the war continues largely because Iran had or has enough of these drones, right?
Yeah, they're extremely cheap. They're extremely, easy to mass produce, and Iran has the advantage of their, mountainous terrain, and they can easily, hide the launch sites deep in bunkers and move them around. The same thing that Russia does. And it's proved to be a very easy way of and a very cheap way of escalating the war, reaching far across the region, even hitting this British base in Cyprus. We remember that in the first few days of the war. And closing the Strait of Hormuz, the same thing that Russia does, basically, with these almost nightly mass attacks all across Ukraine. Even the very western areas, very very far from the front line, are not safe always from these drones. But what Ukraine has understood that they need a systemic approach to counter. They need to use data to be able to track the way they fly, the patterns they fly in, where's the best place to set up your limited air defense assets to be in the best place to catch these drones. And now the big innovation of the last year has been interceptor drones, which are very small, very cheap, but designed with a very specific purpose of hunting down these Shaheds midair. I've seen it happen in real time from the feeds that come from these drones. And now we see Russia having increasingly less success with them in their attacks. Meanwhile, Iran is using the very rudimentary model and having a lot of success because these countries haven't learned from Ukraine.
But you're in Kyiv with the Kyiv Independent. What about Ukraine and drones on the offensive side? You've been talking so far about the drones that Russia has been able to develop to attack Ukraine, and yet one of the big stories of 2026, even though it's getting kind of overwhelmed by other things in the U.S. media, is here we are 4 years in, and big old Russia has not been able to overwhelm little Ukraine.
Yeah, and the success story is really at every level of the battle space at this point. On the very front line, just a few weeks ago, I was with one of Ukraine's top drone teams flying these very cheap first-person view drones that anyone can assemble in their garage, flying between forests and hunting down individual Russian soldiers way before they even reach the front line. Meanwhile, a little bit further back, we see a lot of success with these mid-range drones, which are actually powered a lot by Western technology, including by AI modules from the former Google co-founder Eric Schmidt, who's invested a lot in drones, causing huge problems for the Russians way behind the front line. And then, of course, maybe perhaps the most spectacular is Ukraine's own success with these long-range drones, which are built inside Ukraine. This is not, Ukraine relying on the West for combat power anymore. It's Ukraine's own defense industry scaling up these long-range drones in a similar way that Iran and Russia use them to hit important targets like kind of military factories, ammunition dumps, and famously oil refineries, oil terminals. And what this does is it raises the cost for Russia, for Vladimir Putin to continue the war. And together with that, together with his economy suffering and his own forces failing to move forward on the front line, is what people in Ukraine hope that this will finally be the moment where he winds his war down. But going forward, it's just another reminder that when it comes to the future of war, which is undeniably going to be dominated by drones, the experience is in the hands of the Russians, it's in the hands of the Ukrainians, they're giving it to the Chinese, and on the side of the West, it's only the Ukrainians who have this experience, and now it's them that can help with the technology, the data, the lessons learned for the United States, for NATO to understand what seemed like the war of the future, but now is the war of the present.
Listeners, anybody have a question for Francis Farrell, reporter at the Kyiv Independent. He's with us live from Kyiv right now. 212-433-WNYC. It can be about this drone warfare that his particular article is about, that we've been discussing, and the implications for the U.S.-Iran Israel war, as well as what's going on between Russia and Ukraine, or anything else on the situation in Ukraine. You can call with a question for Francis Farrell, reporter at the Kyiv Independent, 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. You can also text your question. Staying on the drones and robotic warfare for a minute, and then I actually want to ask you how your news organization is doing, and how information flow is there in Ukraine at this point, as well as how the country is doing in other ways other than the straight military way. But in our previous segment, maybe you heard some of it as you were getting hooked up, we were talking about the potential implications on jobs around the United States and the world by AI robots. So in this context, in an interview by the New York Times, your Minister of Defense in Ukraine, Mihailo Fedorov, said, quote, "In the future, robotic systems will do all of the fighting. The kill zone will empty of people entirely. Unmanned systems will fight among themselves on the ground and in the air," unquote. And in a way, I guess that's a good thing if people aren't getting killed in war. But do you think that's realistic? Is that a widely shared view? Are you familiar with that quote?
Yeah, I mean, that's been the big question that has dominated the battlefield, I think, and the way tactics and technology have evolved in the last year or two in this war. Ukraine, the motivation for Ukraine to move forward at full speed with this adaptation and implementation of technology, including AI, including robotic systems on the ground, is made very clear by the fact that Ukraine is fighting for its land, but it's also fighting for its people, and it's a lot smaller country than Russia. Meanwhile, in Russia, we see that the only way they can attack and move forward remains to be with boots on the ground, with these almost single-use infantry assaults that just keep coming and coming. I've seen them on the drone feeds. I've seen the Ukrainian drones hunt them. And so you understand why it's not just a question of the future of war that Ukraine is going head first into, but where that need comes from. Ukraine has this chronic manpower crisis in their military, and they need to have drones and robots do as much of the fighting as possible. I think it's important not to overlook the human element. We so far we have AI drones kind of doing a part of the job, maybe the last final, hitting the target, but we haven't quite reached this kind of Terminator, Black Mirror kind of future where it's really autonomous robots doing the fighting, and I think that is quite scary for many, many reasons. But for now, it's still very important to have the people to operate these systems, even if it's someone flying a drone with Starlink, from an office in Kyiv. In the future, we do see, the kill zone being emptied of people. That is happening right now. Ukraine doesn't have a long string of infantry defending, every single few hundred yards of the front line. Very often, it's just being defended by drones. But those drones need to be flown by people. They need to be, people need to bring the ammunition to them, to set them up, to take them off, to fly them. And so we're still quite away from that reality, but it does seem like we're moving headfirst in that direction, and the world should take notice.
As we continue with Francis Farrell, live from Kyiv with the Kyiv Independent, here's a text that came in, Francis, that says, a comment rather than a question. I am embarrassed by the lack of support the U.S. government has provided to Ukraine, but want your guest and others to know how much so many of us support them and are amazed by their bravery and fight. The American people are with you, followed by 2 heart emojis. So I thought you would like that one. And kind of along those lines, I think, Eric in the West Village, you're on WNYC. Hi, Eric.
Hi, thanks for taking my call, and thank you for having your guest. I've written about Kyiv recently, arguing about the need for Europe for many years to do something it talked about doing at the beginning of the war and has not done, but I think it's especially timely to do so, and that is closing the western Ukrainian skies. Because while things are going very well or better than they had been for Ukraine, I think there should be no illusion that Russia isn't done with the war. Western Ukraine is still suffering a great deal from Kyiv on to the west, from continued Russian attacks, and Europe wants to show that it can stand on its own. It also needs to show that its sovereignty will not be violated by Russia, as has been happening for many, many months, if not years, by what Russia has done. And the action of coordinating a purely defensive posture, which of course is never limited to just defense, because it's very possible they'll have to respond to the places from which the missiles are coming from if they are attacked, is something which I think diplomats as well as military officials should be considering to coordinate to show that Europe and Ukraine are together and that they will stand up to aggression. And if it's possible to speak with the writer afterwards, I'd be happy to give my contact information, because it's something I continue to study. And I just wanted to ask him whether he would like to see an effort towards integrating more airspace defensiveness from Europe on Ukraine.
Thank you, Eric. We'll put you on hold and take your contact information off the air in case our guest is interested. But Francis, what are you thinking with respect to that phone call?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. That's a great point. I 100% agree with you, and I've actually written about this myself. One thing where this comes up, I think, in the politics of Europe is when they, especially in the previous year, when we saw, Trump like talking a lot to Putin and seemingly on the verge of completely abandoning Ukraine, which he almost did. The Europeans were often saying, they were getting upset because they think they should have a seat at the table of the negotiations, and they think the Ukraine is part of Europe, and therefore the way this war ends, Europe needs to be a part of this discussion. But I was saying to them, we're very grateful for your support, but so long as you do not want to bring anything into Ukraine itself, you don't want to have boots on the ground, that's understandable, but you don't even want to have trainers, and you don't even want to defend the sky of Western Ukraine, which is what Eric was suggesting. That basically shows that you don't have skin in the game. And so long as President Putin and the Russian military believe that they can continue this war of attrition by breaking the Ukrainian military and then, taking as much of the country as they want, you don't have a say in it, because they could keep going even up to Western Ukraine on the ground if they caused a Ukrainian collapse. And so, and of course, here also the important thing to understand is that Moscow and Putin especially, much has been said about the fact that they only respect strength. They don't respect compromise. They don't respect good faith in negotiations. They only respect strength. And for that reason, of course it would have been difficult logistically. Of course it would have been unpopular and risky politically. But even that step of defending the sky of Western Ukraine, or even setting that in motion, would have been a very clear sign to Russia to say that, no, your plan on, breaking Ukraine, you might have some success on the front line in the short term, but in the long term, it's completely doomed. So thank you for that comment, and yeah, very much on point. I would agree.
Listener asks in a text, whose drone technology do you think is actually ahead? Because Russia innovated the fiber optic filaments I think, writes the listener. We hear a lot about Ukrainian drones hunting Russian soldiers, but not the opposite. Are we just being told what we want to hear?
Great question. And it's a question that really dominates a kind of analysis of the war in the last year. Russia did, in fact, yes, come up with the fiber optic drone first, but Ukraine has copied it and scaled it up. I was with a fiber optic drone team just a few weeks ago in Donbass, watching them use it very effectively against Russian soldiers, against Russian artillery positions. In general, the way it usually works is that Ukraine tends to be a better environment for innovation. They have just more people on the job, I think more motivation because their country is on the line. And they do have very useful contacts and resources and networks with the West, with Western tech, with Western defense companies. And a big example of that is the way that these drones from Eric Schmidt's company are being used now in operational depth in southern Ukraine, in Crimea, to cut off Russian logistics using AI models. A huge advantage that Ukraine now has is the use of Starlink. I think it was a big surprise for us in February this year that our defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, who is a similar big tech loving guy, you mentioned Palantir earlier. Yeah. So he got on the phone with Elon Musk because the Russians were really using Starlink a lot and it was causing a lot of problems. And the fact that he convinced Musk to turn it off, despite Elon Musk's very regular flirting with Russian propaganda, was a huge deal. And in many ways, it seems like in this year, Ukraine does have the edge in technology. Russia has scale, Russia has size, and their drone force is something to be reckoned with. But in technology, it looks like the edge is with Ukraine.
Hey, we just have about a minute left, but how's the economy? We never hear about this. We hear about who's getting killed and who's winning on what battlefield, but how are Ukrainians who are not actually directly involved in the fighting getting by through all this? And how's your news organization? Is there a business model for journalism there? It's collapsing in the United States.
Thanks. I mean, the economy, there's no getting around the fact that it's very dependent on European support at this point. When it comes to the state still functioning, pensions, state services. But on the ground here in Kyiv, we still see new cafes, new businesses open. You see a lot of life going on between the missile attacks. And when it comes to media, we're in a very special position because our news organization is funded not by billionaires, not by European grants or USAID that could disappear at any moment, but just by our readers. The Kyiv Independent's revenue comes from the members of our community. We try and do our best to communicate Ukraine and the war to the Western world, like I'm doing right now, or on YouTube or on the website. And so, and a lot of our members are from the US. I was at an event in NYC just in December with some of our members, and it was really special to meet them. So if anyone wants to join, do check us out, and we might come to your city again sometime soon. Because that's we have less and less foreign media, especially big media, coming to Ukraine, especially going to the front line from where I report. So more and more, it feels like it's important not to stop doing what we're doing.
Yeah. Well, next time you're in New York, come and see us. And in the meantime, good luck to you and everyone there. And something is good technology, because this connection between New York and Kyiv has been quite clear. Sometimes we have more glitchy lines to Brooklyn. But Francis Farrell, reporter at the Kyiv Independent, thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian. Great to talk to you. Have a good one.
WNYC Studios is supported by AT&T. Summer. It's when we share more time, more memories, and more photos. And at AT&T, the iPhone 17 Pro is your summer essential. Its center stage front camera auto-adjusts the frame to fit everyone into group selfies. Right now at AT&T, ask how you can get iPhone 17 Pro on them with eligible trade-in. Requires eligible plan. Terms and restrictions apply, subject to change. Visit att.com/iPhone or visit an AT&T store for details.